I'm really excited to introduce Michèle Hayeur Smith. She is an anthropological archaeologist who is a research associate at the Hafenrenner Museum of Anthropology at Brown University, and she specializes in the sort of the North Atlantic and the Viking age, and particularly looking at the issues around gender. I first discovered Michèle's work when I was researching the fabric of civilization and was interested in the use of textiles as money, as currency. And I found that she was the expert on that in Iceland. And I quoted her papers in my book. But after all that, I forget how, but I became aware that she was going to do a talk about her then brand new book. It's still pretty new. And I will donate my copy to the library on the assumption that I can get it back whenever I can check it out whenever I need it. She has written up her extensive research in this book. And I was lucky to listen to a Zoom talk that she gave around the publication of the book. And so I'm really happy to have her here to talk about weaving in the Viking Age and what it tells us about all kinds of things, including the role of women. And also, she's going to do a little bit of a loom demonstration using the warp weighted looms. So, Michèle, I am going to turn it over to you at this point. And everyone, please mute yourself if you are not Michèle.
I'm just, hang on, close that. Okay, there we go. Well, thank you very much. And thank you to the Weavers Guild for inviting me, and also to Virginia today for having reached out. So I have to say, I am not a weaver. I have to say that right off the bat, even though I have dabbled in the warp weighted loom, in part to help with my just with understanding what I was seeing archaeologically. So I am an archaeologist. That's the first thing I do. One thing I have to say right off the bat is that it is extremely rare for textiles to survive in the archaeological record. So it's usually not something you find on sites because they are organic remains and they tend to be eaten up by bacteria pretty quickly. So if you do have textiles, that's pretty astounding. And it just turns out actually that the North Atlantic was such a place, and in part because of the preservation. And one of the places I actually started to work was in Iceland. So I'm going to share my screen and show you some slides. Here we go. Hang on a second to try and get the slideshow. Play from the start. Here we go. So I'm going to talk to you today about this work. And you know how I came into actually ending up in Iceland, but I also ended up working in Greenland, and then in the Faroe Islands and in Scotland. So basically all the areas that were part of, if you want, were part of the Norse world. In the 8th century, the Vikings left Scandinavia and started to migrate to Europe, and started with these short voyages of pillaging and piracy, which eventually turned into trade, which eventually turned into settlement by the 9th century. And they go sort of all over Europe, but one of the places where they end up expanding sort of in the 9th century is into the North Atlantic. And many of them leave, these were Norwegians, although the Vikings are Norwegian, Swedes, and Danes, but the Norwegians left, some of them left directly from Norway and went towards the North Atlantic islands. Others went from the British Isles because they were already settled there and had sort of already amalgamated in the British Isles, and then moved toward Iceland as well. If you are, for example, a Viking who happens to have settled in Scotland, for example, it is about a week to sort of travel, you know, between these islands, and you can sort of see them one from the other. So if you're in Orkney or you're in the Northern Isles, you can see Shetland in certain areas. From there, you can see the Faroe Islands. From the Faroe Islands, you can see Iceland, and from Iceland, you can see Greenland. So it's actually kind of a logical jump across the North Atlantic. And these people migrated across that area. And they brought with them, obviously, their own cultural traditions and whatnot, of not only textile production, but also their agricultural practices and basically the Norse way of life from Europe. They were also very fortunate in that in the Faroe Islands and in Iceland, they encountered no local inhabitants at all, which wasn't the case, obviously, when they were in Scotland. But in the North Atlantic Islands, they encountered no local inhabitants. So they basically just settled there. When they got to Greenland, there were the Inuit, but they were much farther north at the time. And so in essence, in the first sort of 200-300 years of the settlement, or 200 years of the settlement, there was nobody there. Eventually, these populations started migrating south, and then you start to see clashes between the Norse and the Inuit in these regions. So I became interested in textiles in part because my mother was an anthropologist and collected textiles. And if you were in the room where I am here, you'd see that there's all kinds of ethnographic textiles all around me, thanks to her. So this is something that I had been sort of exposed to, very young, but never actually wove myself. And we started a project with my husband in Western Iceland, excavating a site there. And a lot of the archaeological sites in Iceland, or the farms, are settled sort of over 1,000-year period, but they often will stay on the same farm. You end up with these deposits which are huge, and they sort of look like these tells. If you've ever heard of the tells, for example, of the Neolithic, it's these massive mounds of just constant resettling on the same spot, which means archaeologically they're actually really pretty complicated to excavate because they're very complex in their structures and so on. So in Iceland, it was a little bit like that. So we were doing some test pits, and of course, what comes out of the ground but textiles galore. And I started to think, okay, maybe I should deal with these textiles after all. And I wrote a small project and to the National Science Foundation, to Arctic Social Sciences, which is part of the Department of Polar Programs at NSF, and to do kind of a survey of what exactly was there in terms of material in Iceland, for example, because there's really there was a lot coming out of this site. And to my surprise, the National Museum of Iceland was actually packed with textiles. And I was like, okay, I think here's my work cut out for the next, 20 years, I guess, because there was a lot of material. And these are not really nice textiles. I like to call them as the dirty brown rags, because they really are little bits of scrappy brown cloth. So, and they had been kind of ignored actually by people. So what I did is then I went back and I wrote another grant. And I wrote a grant from 2010 that ran from basically 2010 to 2013, still to National Science Foundation, called Rags to Riches, an archaeological study of textiles and gender in Iceland from 874 to 1800. So looking at textiles from the Viking Age, which is the early settlement of these places, basically till the 19th century. And one of the reasons why I wanted to look at such a large time frame was in part because I thought maybe I might not have enough data, which actually turned out to be wrong. So I had a lot of data. But anyways, it also gives you a perception of how textiles changed over 1,000-year period among a fairly homogeneous population. After I had done that one, and this is actually when the big study of cloth being used as currency sort of popped up, I wanted to see what was happening in the rest of the colonies of the North Atlantic. So places like Greenland, like the Faroe Islands, like Scotland. So in 2013, I was awarded the second grant, which was going to compare what I had seen in Iceland basically with the rest of the North Atlantic in terms of, what was sort of going on. And then the grant I'm currently working on, which is actually supposed to be finished, but because of COVID is not finished. And we couldn't travel, we couldn't collect samples or do anything. So it's still ongoing. And this is looking actually at trade in these North Atlantic textiles towards Northern Europe, which is not a story that we know a lot about. So what I thought I'd talk to you a little bit today is a bit about this issue of currency. And I thought I'd also give you a demo. Like I said, I'm not a weaver, so I took a course in 2019 in Norway on weaving pile weaving actually in a small living museum in Österoy, it was called. And the type of cloth is called Varafeldir. And here's the piece I wove. So it's basically a shaggy pile weave. And you can see these big tufts that we insert on. So this is a very ancient technique. This type of shaggy pile weave goes back to the Viking Age, actually goes beyond the Viking Age. And this you could see if you think about hairy Vikings. This is why you think about hairy Vikings, because these were their raincoats. And these are worth actually a lot of money. A cloak made out of this stuff was worth a fair amount of money. So what I have on the loom behind me, which you can see right here, my warp weighted loom, is you can see me trying to do another one of these. So I'll show you that basically at the end. As Virginia said, I'm interested in exploring issues of gender, and that was the kind of the idea behind behind the whole thing. I was like, okay, great, I can look at these textiles, and there's different ways that you can work with textiles in archaeology. You can sort of focus mostly on the technical aspects and the analytical aspects of the actual textiles themselves, or you can use the textiles to try and figure out, well, what does this tell me about the society who made these textiles? And that's always been my approach, and that's a slightly more anthropological approach to it. So if we have, these thousands of textiles, what are they telling us about the society? And I rapidly found out, that these were woven exclusively by women, which is not always the case in every society. In some societies, men are the weavers, but in the North Atlantic, women are the only weavers. And what I rapidly also found out is that they were woven on every single farm. And these settlements in the North Atlantic are not going to be as organized as they are, let's say, in Scandinavia, where they have trade centers, they have the beginnings of towns. There are no towns in the North Atlantic. There are no towns in the Faroes. There's no towns in Iceland. There's no towns in Greenland. And so these are being woven on every single farm, and they're being woven by women. So I thought, one of the problems that I found, and you find this, not only in archaeology, but in archaeology, it's a problem. It's that the archaeology is focused mostly on men and on male institutions, and has looked at things like subsistence and political power and warfare. But nobody talks about the other half of the population in the settlement of these colonies and what they did. So that was kind of my goal. And I thought, what better way of, in fact, getting at women than looking at the items that women made? And this would give me, a different sort of take on the story. And like I said, I mentioned before that textiles don't preserve well. Well, there is an advantageous situation in Iceland, particularly, not so much in the Faroe Islands, a little bit in Greenland as well, but mostly in Iceland. Is what they did is that they used textiles for everything. Everything. They were used for tents, they were used as sails, they were used as saddle blankets, they were used as blankets, as pillows, as clothing. And in Iceland, they were also used as currency, meaning that you might pay your taxes in cloth. You might pay bride price in cloth. And these are accompanied with legal documents that actually support this type of currency. So they were hugely important in the settlement of this area. Plus, it's a cold region, so you need to stay warm as well. What they ended up doing when they used the textiles is that they would frequently dispose of them. And when they were disposed of, they were in pretty ratty shape. Garments were repatched to death. Some garments have 17 patches on them. I don't think this was an issue for them in the same way that we think, oh gosh, we can't wear clothes that are all ripped and have patches on them. And I think that for them, this is just the way life was. Okay, you're in a hard environment, a very harsh environment. There's not a lot up there. In Iceland, your resources are basically wool and fish, and that's it. That's all you have to offer to the world. And so you don't get a lot of contact with Europe. You don't have a lot of the things that we might take for granted. For example, having wheat or wood. There's not a lot of forest. These areas are they were more forested in the Viking Age, but that rapidly came to an end due to overexploitation of the land. So they really did reuse what they had. When they were finally done with them, they would throw them in their garbage dumps, which we call middens in archaeology. And one of the techniques they were using in house construction in the North Atlantic is they were using turf blocks because they did not have enough wood. So they would cut the sod on the ground and then stack that in almost like bricks in a way and create houses that had timber frames on the inside, but that had the outside was completely constructed with these turf blocks. When these collapse, this was kind of the building material. So what they also did is that these would collapse sometimes in the houses, stuff gets stuck under it, or else they would take these blocks of turf and throw them in the garbage dumps to cap the garbage. So if you're throwing out all your bones, the remains of meals and so on, and then capping it with turf, this creates a very, very acidic environment, which woolen textiles love. So they preserve. Bone doesn't even like it so much. So you end up with the bone disintegrating, but your textiles come out beautifully. So these are particular conditions, and it's like that with organic remains in archaeology, that certain environments are required for artifacts to preserve in that way. And textiles, like I said, really like acidic soils. Permafrost is another one that's great, which is what you see in Greenland, where the ground is actually frozen. So things end up preserving. So I wanted to show you, just to show you the amount that there were in these regions. For example, Iceland has, and this is really conservative, 8,000 to 10,000 fragments of cloth. I've looked at 36 sites with textiles dating from the Viking Age to the 19th century. And I would say there's probably actually more than that. And I've looked at a lot of the material, but there are still sites that have got thousands of pieces of cloth. Some of the more recent ones, the more recent you come in time, the more stuff there is. In Greenland, there's roughly between 736 and 1,000 plus textiles. Also, every time people excavate, they often find more. So the numbers keep increasing. And the Faroe Islands has this really tiny amount of 142. For some reason, the textiles in the Faroe Islands do not preserve as well as they do in the other locations. So that just gives you kind of a sense. Now, one of the things like I said, for me, that what's really been important on this is one, looking for women, but also what do the textiles tell us about society? So while I do use technical analyses, I'm not as thrilled about it. I'm more interested in what do these mean? Why are people doing what they're doing? Why are they using textiles as money, for example? Or why, if you are looking at the technical sides, for example, why does suddenly at some point in time, the Greenlanders change the way they make cloth and they start making cloth differently? Because the climate got cold, so they adapt. And so these are the sorts of stories that I'm trying to pull out of the textiles, because they are reflective, like any form of material culture, of the societies that create them. And so I like to use Janet Berlow, who is another textile archaeologist, who wrote this quote, which actually kind of really sums it up, because they really touch, if you think about it, all aspects of who we are and what we do, and have done so in the past. And she says, as a mode of self-presentation, textiles assert personal, ethnic, religious, and economic identities. They're also eloquent historical texts encoding change, appropriation, oppression, endurance, as well as personal and cultural aesthetic visions. So when I look at 1,000 years of textile production, textiles in non-industrial contexts do not change very rapidly. They change very slowly. But when they do change, it's because something happened. They either converted to Christianity, or it got really cold, because in the 1300s in the North Atlantic, you had a thing called the Little Ice Age, where the temperatures dropped suddenly. Probably the reason why the Greenland Norse colony died out as well. And you can see these changes, these adaptations. And so to me, what these are modes of female expression. These are the way women express themselves. This was a somewhat patriarchal society. Women, men took great pride, for example, in the spoken word, in sort of manipulating poetry and being sort of very eloquent with their words. And women didn't speak, but women wove. And you could say, okay, yeah, well, they wove tapestries, and so they would tell the stories of their families, of their people, and these huge tapestries would line the insides of their longhouses. What better mode of expression? But they also express themselves through the dirty brown rags that we find sitting in the museum that nobody paid any attention to for the past 100 years, because they're not pretty pieces. But if you look at them cumulatively, they do start to tell you a story about society. And they will tell you, for example, in Iceland, they tell you a lot about economy. They tell you a lot about the role of women in economy, in trade, in the paying of taxes, in how these things were regulated, because they were regulated. Any currency is going to be highly standardized and is going to be regulated at some level. That's what defines it as a form of currency. Even though their economy wasn't based on coins, it was based on a barter exchange economy that was actually originally based on the value of and the weight of silver. In Iceland, they didn't have any silver anymore, so they turned to other things. Textiles will also tell you a lot about dress and tell you about, for example, what people wore, what social groups they belonged to in society by the way things were made, by which textiles they chose. For example, in the Viking Age, you'll find that the textiles are very abundant. There's all kinds of different weaves, and there's lots of colorful weaves. There's embroidery added, and all that stops in the Middle Ages. The minute you end the Viking Age, which is roughly around 1050 to 1100, total change. Obviously, those who have got elaborate textiles are going to be people who are more well off. So that's going to tell you also something about where people belong and who they belong to. So this brings me to another thing I'm going to talk about. I'm going to just mention this briefly, but I'll talk about it in more depth in a bit when we get to the loom. One thing I found through my research was that, in fact, textiles also in the Norse context seem to be associated with otherworldly things. First of all, it was women who wove. But if you start to read a little bit and you look in the sagas, the sagas are texts that were written down 200 years after the end of the Viking Age, but they tell stories that happened during the Viking Age. And they're actually full of information, and they're full of sort of beliefs and attitudes. And there's all kinds of stories about women and textile work, of potentially textile work being associated with birth, with death, with the control of fate, which was a very important thing in the Norse context. And there's actually a little, and this is why actually I called the paper about Hoskuld, because it comes actually from the sagas. I'm going to read you a little excerpt from the book, The Valkyrie's Loom. And one of the sagas is called Nyal Saga. I'm not sure if anybody's heard of this, but there's all sorts of things that happen in this saga, and I won't get into the whole story, but there is a woman called Hildegund. And one of the things that women did in Norse society is they did a lot of goading, which was basically harassing their men to seek revenge for their family honor. Honor was a very big issue. And women's roles are often in the preservation of family lineages, family histories. And one of the things that they do a lot of is they goat their men so that they seek revenge, so they go after. And what she does is she actually goes after her uncle, whose name is Flossi, and her own husband was killed. And his name was Hoskuld. So he was murdered by somebody, and she wants her uncle to take revenge on her son, on her husband. And she says, so Hildegund, she takes out a cloak which her uncle Flossi had given Hoskuld, her husband, and which he was wearing when he had been killed. She had preserved all his blood in it, and she returned to the hall with the cloak and went quietly up to Flossi. Flossi had eaten, and the food had been cleared from the table. Hildegund flung it over Flossi, and the blood clots showered all over him. Then she said, "You gave this cloak to Hoskuld, Flossi, and now I'm giving it back to you. He was killed in it. I call God and all good men to witness that I charge you by all the powers of your Christ and your manhood and bravery to avenge the wounds that he had on his body when he was killed, or else be called a neathing." A neathing is like an insult of being called homosexual or being effeminate, which was a big insult in the Norse context, and contemptible creature by all men. So the reason why I chose this is that it really kind of gives you a sense of also how they perceive textiles, is that textiles are almost like a part of your person, of who you are. That your clothes, somebody once told me, oh, you should never, someone in Iceland actually told me, you should never wear somebody else's clothes because they have their soul and their essence in it. So there's definitely this connection in the Norse context between the person, their fate, their state of being alive, and the clothing that they wear, almost like if it was a second kind of skin. And this in turn is also associated with one of the powerful goddesses, which is the goddess Freya, who happens also to be the goddess of weaving. In fact, we get the word Friday from her. And on Friday was the day when women wove flax. And one of her other names, because Norse gods usually have more than one name, was Horn. And Horn means flax. And this was the day when women worked the flax. Now, she's also the goddess of a type of magic that is only practiced by women, which is called Seðir. And it's a type of divination, and Seðir itself is connected with spinning. So you can see this connection of textile work, women's magic, birth, life, death, fertility. She's also a goddess of fertility, that are all kind of amalgamated together. And I think that this is an underlying element in Norse society that even when they become Christian, they may not remember all the stories associated, but the attitudes are still there. So what happens in the North Atlantic is that women continue weaving for basically until the Danish trade monopoly, or until the Danish colonial authorities take over textile production in Iceland in about 1700. So that's 800 years where women are the sole weavers in Norse society, and they are not using any kind of loom other than the one behind me, which is a Neolithic loom called the warp-weighted loom. So I'm just going to move forward. So I was going to, this is actually probably a waste of time, because I'm sure all of you know this already completely very well, but this is for my audiences who don't know anything about textiles. But like I mentioned to you before, in the Viking Age, textiles, they had all kinds of different types of weave. They had tabby weaves and 2-2 twills, lozenge twills, herringbone twills, these shaggy pile woven cloaks. They did a lot of tablet weaving. So there's all kinds of different weaves. They used a lot of color. I always say the Vikings really like their bling. They like flashy stuff. It looks good. Then Christianity sets in, and that's it. We're down to roughly two, you do find the other weaves occasionally, but it's mostly tabby weaves and 2-2 twills in Iceland at any rate. And here's just a 2-2 twill, which I'm sure you know. So, and the other thing that happens in Iceland, so you've got all this kind of cool stuff happening where there's lots of really interesting textiles, colorful stuff, different things. They add furs into it. There's color, there's gold thread, there's applique, there's silk. They even in Scandinavia, they incorporate silk bands into their clothing. And then in Iceland, you hit about 1000 AD when they convert to Christianity, and then everything comes to a grinding halt. And these two types of weaves emerge as the dominant types. It's also at this point in time that vadmal, which is the cloth currency, becomes an absolute booming phenomena in Iceland. And if you hear some archaeologists, actually this is what it looks like, but let's just go back to this. If you'll hear some archaeologists will tell you that, oh, that boom in cloth currency only goes up until about 1300 and then it's all fish. And that's false. According to what I found, the boom in textiles used as money goes on until 1700, until the Danes come in and introduce a coin economy. So they don't have coins. They're based on a barter economy. So they exchange. If I have a cow and you have a slave and I want your slave, well, I will give you so many cows for your slave. Now, this is recorded in the law book, exactly what is worth what. So it's not just, this is a great exchange. No, you have to go back to the law book, which is called Graugas, which will tell you exactly what is worth what. And the basic unit of measure is silver, 1 ounce of pure silver. But eventually what happens is that Iceland has less and less contact with Scandinavia, and so they have less and less silver. Now in Scandinavia, if you didn't have silver, everything was measured in function of this fictitious amount of silver if you didn't actually have silver. So you would know that butter was worth so much silver versus, fish were worth so much silver. So you could do that kind of exchange if you wanted. And textiles were one of them. But in Iceland, they seem to have mostly focused on the textiles. And everything becomes written or becomes basically measured in relationship to this thing that they call vadmal. In fact, they eventually stopped talking about silver altogether as you move through the medieval period. And it integrates 2 Norse words, which is vað, which means cloth, and mal, to measure. So vadmal means cloth made to measure. So this is cloth money. And women are weaving money, which always, whenever I tell my Icelandic audiences, I tell the women, you don't realize, but you guys are making money. I mean, this is incredible. This is amazing. Where are women making money like this? Think about the power that was involved in that sort of thing. And it was almost always a 2-to-2 twill. It was spun Z to S, always. And it ranged in a thread count from about 4 to 14 warp threads per centimeter, if you count your warp threads, which I do a lot of. And what did they use this for? Well, they used it to purchase goods, to pay taxes and tithes, to pay rents, to pay fines, for legal compensation. It was also used commercially overseas in trade, which would mean generally in Iceland, they would meet one time a year at the central there was a central parliament. So the Vikings were not unruly savages, as we often think. They were actually highly legal. And they had a law speaker who would stand on a rock and who would recite the law. People would bring their grievances from all over Iceland once a year at a site called Thingvellir, which is in southern Iceland. It's called the Althing, and they would determine what the penalty, it was a very democratic system, and they would determine what the penalty of a person was if they had done, let's say they had murdered their neighbor or something like that. And a lot of the compensations were actually measured in how much cloth they would have to pay. So again, remember, this is a society that has no trade, no urban centers. This is happening on the farms. So who's telling them how the cloth has to be woven? It's not an item that's necessarily controlled by elites, but of course, I imagine elite farms have more people weaving, more women weaving, so they probably had a surplus of cloth. But every farm was producing vodmal. Everybody was producing vodmal. So the minute you start looking at textiles in the medieval period from Iceland, it's basically one piece of cloth after the next, which is almost identical to the last. And so it is days and days of looking at the same kind of thing. And there are different grades and different qualities. And I got to the point where I can tell you exactly what's good for currency and what's garbage and what should be paid to the church. So if I can gain that knowledge from looking at them, I think to myself, well, the women who made this stuff must have really known how this was made, because the men were not going near this, because I think there were taboos. Again, because of these associations that I mentioned to you before, of associations with female magic, and potentially there's actually literal descriptions of if men get involved in textile production or get involved in any form of female magic, this could affect their masculinity. They could be considered effeminate. They could be homosexual. And this was not what they wanted. This was not acceptable in that context. So this is what it looks like. It's always brown. It doesn't necessarily mean it was brown before, but don't forget it's been sitting in the ground for close to 1,000 years. So of course it's brown. And just to show you a little bit the abundance of how much material. Again, now all these sites that I've got listed here often have Viking Age components and then medieval components. Some are mostly medieval, and I've put the dates next to them right here that you can see roughly what they are. They're all different kinds of sites. This one right here was a monastery. This one was a trade site. This is another monastery, a large farm, another large farm. And you can see that the twills always outnumber, even the plain weave, and then other types of weave, obviously, which are there. But the main dominant weave that you come across in the collections are 2-to-2 twills. Now, I have to say also, these are all woolen textiles. You might say, well, where's the linen? Where are the linen textiles? There was no cotton at the time, so it was linen was the other alternative. And the linen textiles do not preserve very well because they are cellulose based and they tend to disintegrate over time. So what we have is really, we have a kind of a skewed view of the past in the sense that we're only seeing woolen textiles, but it's what we have. So we do with what we can. So this is basically, these are some of the legal guidelines. So like I said before, this stuff was all written down in the law books, who I presume the men are writing this down. So it makes you kind of wonder, well, what's the relationship between men and women? Because the women know how it's made, they make it, and the men write it down in the law book. So what does that mean? So basically, you remember the ounce of silver I mentioned? Well, the equivalent of that 1 ounce unit of silver was actually what they would call 2 L's, or they would call this Öln or Alnir in Icelandic, 2 L's wide with about 6 L's in length. That's your basic unit of measure. So that's like, just think about that as like an inch, let's say. Now 1 L's was generally equivalent to your forearm. That's so roughly 49.2 centimeters, but this changes also through time, expands to 55.6 centimeters. So 49.2 centimeters is about, at 2 L's, that's about 1 meter by 6 L's is about 3 meters. So your 1 ounce unit is 1 meter by 3 meters of cloth. That's like one package of currency right there. Okay, so you might have to give much more than that. You might have to give somebody 12 L's of cloth, or 12, 1 ounce units. So you need 12 of those if you had to pay your, depending on what your taxes would cost you. So it actually is money. It's not just some fictitious idea. It is actually something that you are paying with. Like I said, the L shifts in its size and its length. It starts out in this medieval law book as 49.2, but it changes around 1100 to be 56. There was an earlier one that was 46. So if you start tracking in the medieval law books, you find that it starts to change. Now, this is probably due to trade going on between Iceland and the rest of Europe. I'm thinking England, where the L's, because it tends to track also the English L. So this is an old unit that is also used in Europe at the time. And the width of it will also change. So think again about this. And it's always important to remember this is happening at home on individual farms of people who don't have anything, but they're regulating this material pretty closely. It's women who are doing this. It's kind of incredible, in a way when you think about that. So they also had measurements, and I found this document here of this lady who is taking her. This is the sheriff who is measuring her vavmal with what they call a stika, and this was a stick which measured actually 1/10 of a 20 L length. And they even had, some of the churches had this, so you could go and put your cloth up to make sure you had the right amount of cloth, the legal amount. It had to be woven appropriately too. And if you did not weave cloth appropriately, you could be outlawed. So there is a story actually in one of the sagas. There was a 10th century Norwegian merchant called Helgi, apparently, who was buying some of these cloaks. These are made out of this Varafeldir. This stuff is worth the double of vavmal. So this is even more valuable, probably because it takes longer to make. It has more, it's more time consuming, and it also has a lot more wool in it as well. So he makes this deal with this guy called Thorir Akraskeg, and they make an agreement that he's going to buy some of these cloaks, which are, like I said, worth a lot of money. He drops off his cloaks, and Helgi, the Norwegian merchant, sails off the north of Iceland and then looks at the cloaks, and they're all full of holes. So he goes back to Iceland and then tries to go after Thorir, who eventually is taken to the Althing. Remember the Althing I told you about, where they meet once a year, the parliament, and he is outlawed from Iceland. I think he ends up getting killed because it's not the only nasty thing he does. But this is really serious. If you provide vavmal that is not up to standards, then you are in trouble, and you are in trouble of your life, and you're in trouble of being outlawed. Another funny thing I like to tell the Icelanders is, like, imagine the power you had over men if you didn't like your husband. You just have to start weaving crappy vavmal and get him arrested. So there you go, because it would probably fall on him, not on her. So what was interesting, so I went back to all the thousands of pieces of cloth that I looked at, and I said, I want to compare the medieval documents to what I'm actually seeing in the textiles. Does this actually work? Does this coincide? And what about thread counts as well? So I started counting threads, and then I started plotting them. And you can see these are from all these various medieval sites, and you can see this nice, neat little cluster right here. What that is, that's standardization. And that's one of the characteristics of currency. Currency has to be standardized so people understand its value and understand its meaning. Our currency is highly standardized in terms of its weight, in terms of how it looks and the marks it has and so on. Well, they did the same thing, but they did it with cloth. And I had a hard time finding information about thread counts, but I did find some information about other textile people who had looked at this before I had. One was Marta Hoffman, who's like, has the Bible of the warp weighted loom. And she had come up with actually very similar calculations of thread counts as I had, sort of between 4 to 5 to about 15 warp threads per centimeter. And like I said, the more you look at the stuff, the more you kind of, you become aware kind of the different grades of it. There is some of this vodmal that's in this end, and it's very crappy and it's very loose. And they actually had a term for it. It was called pakka vodmal, which means packing vodmal. So you would have used this for trade to wrap your fish in, or, make sacks out of it, stuff like that. Then you have the other one, which was this one in this category. This is the money vodmal. This is the stuff that you're paying, basically your, your sort of your taxes and so on with. See, so going on to the thread count. So then I also, if you see this arrangement here, you see this really, really tight standardization. And this is not just one piece of cloth here. These are stacks and stacks of cloth. So this is a very, very tight cluster that is really showing the standardization. And if you compare it, let's say, again, the standardization to, let's say, the early modern period in Iceland, which is between around 750, the textiles are off the chart in a different direction because you have a lot of influx of foreign textiles coming in at this point. Around 1603, Denmark, I should say that Iceland, Faroes, and no longer Greenland, but Orkney as well, and Shetland were all part of Denmark. They were part of a Danish sort of colony. And Denmark didn't show much interest in these islands at all. They were considered poor, kind of off the end of the earth type of thing. But in around 1603, they decide to start controlling trade, and they impose what they call the Danish trade monopoly in 1603, where they really limit who's allowed to buy. It's mostly because of the fish, actually, because of cod. But they also start to show a renewed interest in the wool, and they start to change. By 1700, they start to introduce new looms into Iceland, the spinning wheel, because they're only spinning on the drop spindle until then. And they also introduce coinage. And another thing they do is they radically change textile production. They take women out of the equation completely. They take men, they train them in Copenhagen. They set up these workshops, which have already been in existence in Europe since the 14th century. And they have men doing all the weaving. And the women are not weaving anymore. The women are spinning for the workshops. Doesn't work very well. The workshops burned, one of the main one in Reykjavik burned down after 40 years. So it wasn't a very successful endeavor. But nonetheless, you can see that the textiles become much, much more complicated and much more abundant in the later periods after that. And that's sort of what you're seeing here. So like I said, thinking about the thread counts that I had found were roughly, between 4 to 15 or so on. And Marta Hoffman had found a range also between 4 to 14 warp threads per centimeter. Helgi Thorlaksson, who is an Icelandic historian, came up with different grades that he found in a later source, basically, I think, 17th century, where they were actually talking about this pakkavodmal, this packing vodmal, and the gjaldavod, which is the cloth as, which gjald means basically money, so cloth as money. And his gjaldavod was 9 to 10 warp threads per centimeter, so similar to what I had found archaeologically. Then he found also a term called klæðavod, which would have been vodmal for clothing, which was 11 warp threads per centimeter, and another one called smalvod, which was between 11 and 14 warp threads per centimeter, which is the stuff that you would have given to the church to pay your taxes to. So my range that I had found just by counting threads was actually pretty similar to what other people had found using documentary sources. And also just, Marta Hoffman, I think, also looked at some of the actual textiles themselves as well. So you find this, again, this sort of cluster. So I just wanted to reiterate this connection between the mythical world, and this is actually an illustration that is in the book, which tells the story about, again, the association between women these sort of mythical beings, these Valkyries, who are weaving on the warp-weighted loom, and they are connected with activities that determine the fates of men. In Norse mythology as well, there's a big world tree, and under the world tree are 3 Norns who are weaving the fates of humans before they are born. So that before you are born, your fate's already determined what's going to happen to you, and it's these women who are doing this through their spinning activity. So this is a really strong underlying issue in the Norse context. In this particular story, these are 12 Valkyries who fly out of the sky into a farm, and they have a weaving hut, because in the Norse context, in the Viking Age, women often wove all textile work in these separated huts that were next to the houses, and they were called dinja, and these were very much gendered spaces. Men were not allowed in there. If men went in there, terrible things could happen to them. Often in the stories, you hear that they end up dying, they're cursed, or there's awful things. So they don't go near textile work. But this farmer is peering through the window, and these 12 Valkyries are weaving on the warp-weighted loom. Only the warps and the wefts are actually the entrails of men, and the loom weights at the bottom that you see down here are human heads. And all of the components of the loom are the weapons of war. So the heddle rods here are spears. They have weaving swords. Eventually what they do is they take the textile down, they cut it into 12 pieces, they fly off on their horses, they go back into the sky. There's a terrible battle that follows the next day, and all these very significant and important Viking chieftains end up being killed in this battle. So it's kind of like a prophecy, sort of, what happens before this terrible battle of Clontarf in Ireland. So I thought I would, I have actually a couple more things I wanted to say. The tools, while we talk about the tools, and I can show you pictures, and then I'll show you the actual one I have behind me. So they're using this warp-weighted loom, which is here. This one has got 4 heddles. The 4 heddles they use normally when they're doing a 2-to-2 twill, called a thriskeft in Icelandic. I only have 1 heddle because I'm not that good. I don't know how to do this yet. This is beyond my skill. And so I can only weave tabby weaves with my one little heddle, and they're using the drop spindle that you see right here. The other thing I wanted to talk about is the Icelandic sheep, which some of you may know about. Icelandic wool is often referred to as lopi. The Icelandic sheep actually has 2 coats. It's got an outer coat and a very soft, fluffy inner coat. The outer coat is called the tog, and the inner coat is called the thel. In the Viking Age, the women actually separated these 2 fibers, and they used the outer coat for the warp yarns because they are about 3 times coarser than the inner coat. And when you think that you have to you basically hang these yarns, or you're hanging stones from these yarns, they need to be really, really tough. They eventually end up giving up this practice sort of towards the end of the medieval period, and they stop separating them. They comb them. They used to comb them and separate them. And so right today, it's quite hard to find that. I have some actually.
Thank you.
Hello?
Oh, sorry.
Okay. So just to show you also, here's a cross section of the wool when it is not separated, and you can see this Icelandic wool. You see these very fat fibers right here. This is the outer coat, this is the tog, and these little ones here are the thel. So it's really quite noticeable. And like I said, they would have separated these in the Viking Age and in the early medieval period. So this is just also, I wanted just to talk to you a bit about the Varafeldir, which I'm sure you also know, but just to show you the difference between, a modernly woven Varafeldir, which is often woven on a base, either a tabby weave or a 2-to-2 twill. You find them on both, and the vadmal, and you can see that the sort of difference. And this is worth, like I said, much more than the vadmal itself. In fact, just to show you, for example, if you remember our 1 ounce, our 1 ounce unit of 2 L's by 6 L's. So the trade cloak is actually worth 2 ounce units, 4 thumb L's long. So that's 1 L, so your forearm, plus a thumb, which is, everything is sort of written in this weird way. So you have to be able to sort of decipher this. And 2 broad, 13 tufts across the piece. So this tells you legally, and I obviously don't have properly, I could probably be outlawed for this because Mine, I don't have 13 tufts. So these tufts are, I don't know how many tufts I have. I just keep adding them, you know, because who knows? I'm learning, so it's okay. And another thing I just wanted to add, like I said, this is where it was the museum. It's a folk museum in Østerøy in Hordaland in Norway, offers courses of this, or did before COVID. And they still do. And I highly recommend you take it. It's like 3 or 4 days. And they'll show you how to weave different things. They have other sort of traditional Norwegian textiles that they also weave, and they can show you how to do it, all done on the warp weighted loom. So there's pockets in the North Atlantic where they actually continue to use this old loom. And they have been actually doing a bunch of research into the pile weaving, the shaggy pile weaving. And there were actually different knotting techniques in Iceland, in Greenland, and in Ireland. And this is the one I'm doing right now, which, I mean, roughly, more or less, where you're basically you're integrating this into your wefts, and you're looping it around your warp and then letting it hang. And the Greenlandic one, you can see, is a little bit different in how they do it, and the Irish method. So this is done, actually, this type of cloth is made all over Europe. In fact, I'm actually busy writing a paper about it right now, and it goes back, in fact, 4,000 years in the Mediterranean. So it doesn't come from the North Atlantic, it comes really from the Mediterranean. It's also probably related somewhat to the flocati. In fact, I have a flocati that my computer is on right now, which I'd have to show you, but the flocati is completely felted on the back, and the Varafeldir is not. You can see the weave on the back of it. So that's it. So I thought what I would do is now take my computer and move over to the loom and show you a little bit what it looks like. Like I said, I'm not an expert at this. So I was very lucky in that I had, can everybody see this if I hold it like that? Can you see the loom? So I'm gonna hold it up so you can see it a bit better. So you can see the top beam. It's very simple. It's basically made of 3 beams, pretty much. So the idea of this is that it's a loom that you could have transported with you. And this is my heddle right here, which I have knitted. I've knitted the heddles, and you separate from back to front, so that when you open this, it opens up the shed as well. And if you look, I'm going down here, and just to show you what is at the bottom are these loom weights, which are stones. In a lot of places in Scandinavia today, they'll also use bags of sand instead. Ideally, what they taught us is that you should have the same weight in the front and in the back. But so, for example, these two are both 650 grams, but these ones might be less, as long as this one is actually 500 grams, but the one behind it has to also be 500 grams. So you can use small ones if you want, as long as the back and the front are the same on that specific cluster of threads. And they will often, I've got 6 warps tied to the front and 6 on the back. In the Viking Age, they often had 10 warp yarns tied to the front and the back. And also, I was talking to you about the Icelandic sheep and the differences between the outer coat and the inner coat. So this is actually Icelandic wool, where they separated the inner coat out. So this is just the tog. And historically, they would use this actually for fishermen's mittens, because it was very waterproof. It's very greasy. It's got a lot of lanolin on it. It's very coarse and very, very itchy. I decided to weave it and to use this for my weft on this one right here that I'm making right here. I'm trying to, can everybody see this?
Yeah.
Okay. And here you can see also the tufts. If I bring this down, you can see how they just kind of hang. And if I lift it up, you can see how they are actually inserted. So I can show you, I can give you a quick demonstration, and then we can take some questions. So I don't know if you're going to be able to see a lot through here. Can everybody see?
Yeah, actually we can.
Excellent. So here you can say there's a few problems with this. Warping this loom takes quite a few hours. I think probably in the Viking Age they did it a bunch of women together at once because it is complicated. Probably the most important tool is the weaving sword. This one's made out of wood. You can see it's got a little bit of a curve to it. These were often made out of either discarded swords. So again, the associations between battle as well seem to be a common theme. And this I think has to do again with these associations of female magic and battle magic and life and death and all these sort of concepts that I was sort of explaining to you before. And this is really important because after each time you really have to beat it with this weaving sword. So you pass it through here, through your shed, and push it up, and then beat. And then you lift this part. So there's a slight problem in the way I set this loom up, in that when I push it back and I reopen now the back part here, this should be much more open than it is. And this I could probably arrange it by pulling the loom out a little bit so that because it's basically the angle of the loom that's important here, So I think this one is too upright, and if I pulled it back a little bit towards me, I'd actually be able to create a greater space. In fact, I might do this later on. So what I've been doing is I've just been pushing them apart as much as I can like this to be able to get in there. And because this is this is Norwegian wool on here, it's very, very sticky, and which is why you really need to beat it. I also have a warp that broke on here, which is very annoying. And then back through here. You can see it sticking out here. So it's very slow. And if you do this museum course at some point, you'll find that you'll be weaving on this thing for like 8 hours at a time because, obviously you're there for a short period of time. I think we were weaving, the last day we wove on this thing for something like, actually, I think I went into quickly here. So the person who gave me this loom was an Icelandic friend of mine who had this, and the top beam is actually, and this is what they would have done in Iceland, is the top beam was actually driftwood right up here, which came from the north, probably from Greenland actually, and she had somebody basically make it for her. I think I'm not sure where she got this piece. Is here, and her name is actually carved on the top of it in runes. These little sort of supports I made out of twigs because I didn't have any. So I came back from Iceland just with the 3 beams and threw them in the airplane like a pair of skis, and that was it. And then set it up in here. Anyway, so that's about it. That's about summarizes what I have to tell you today. I'm sure there's questions.
Yeah. There are a few questions in the comments, so I'm going to start by looking through those. Some of them you answered in the course of the talk. Okay. Oh yeah, so how long a warp could they put on a loom? And when they were using as vanmal, did they give many pieces of cloth?
You can actually, the idea of this thing here, of this top beam, I'm going to show you. There's a thing here, which is to roll it up. So they actually, if you look on there's a whole bunch of videos of Faroese women who are weaving on this, and I think you can actually see them roll the top. So you can roll your cloth over this beam. I haven't tried it yet because, like I said, I'm not hugely experienced at this yet. So it's I'm still in the learning process.
And someone wanted to know if there's a way that you could show what happens to the stones when you change the shed.
Yes. So I think probably the best thing to do is I'm going to put the computer on the ground here. And one of the important things to think about is the sound it makes. And this is somebody who brought this to my attention, is that women are weaving like this. The sound of the stones clanging together gets a little bit hypnotic. So if I move the shed, and my beam back here is not the greatest because this is not, there we go. You can hear that. And that was, I think, very much a part of the whole thing too, is to think about these women in their longhouses, they're weaving and the stones sort of banging together.
And the animal that was used for the wool was those Icelandic sheep.
It was the Icelandic sheep. It's an Iron Age breed, so it's a sheep that existed in all over Northern Europe. In fact, in Norway, in Shetland, in Scotland, in the Faroe Islands, in Iceland, in Greenland. It's called the Northern Shorttail. Today in Norway, it's called Gamla Norsk. And that's what this wool is. This is Gamla Norsk. It's not the most common breed today, so it's really a specialized breed. In Iceland, it's basically what there is. In the Faroe Islands as well. And in Greenland, pretty much as well, I'd say it's still the dominant breed. The rest of the North Atlantic, there are sort of kind of pockets of it. So I don't know if you've ever heard of the Ronaldsay sheep, who are north of Orkney. And these are sheep that are also the same breed, except they only live on seaweed. And their hairs or the fibers are still, it's the same kind of concept of the dual coated sheep. Apparently the only thing with them is they live exclusively on seaweed. Now they're adapted to it to the point that if they eat hay, they will die because they can't metabolize it anymore. So it's actually changed the breed. So this is a common thing also in the North Atlantic, that they will feed their sheep seaweed because they have sort of a different sort of way, I think, of raising them even today. So in the summer months, what they normally do is they let them go. They go wild. So they're roaming through the hills. And in September, the sheep farmers go out on horseback in certain districts, and they will collect all the sheep that are roaming, and they herd them all back down to the settlement. They still do this every September. It's called the Réttur. And they basically put them in pens, and they have a guy who's called apparently the mountain man, who knows everybody's sheep. And he can tell this is so-and-so sheep, and then they separate them at this point. And this is when they start to kill off the offspring as well. So this is the meat production time. In the Viking Age, if the way they collected the sheep is they would also wait in the spring for the ewes. When they start to nurse, they start to shed their apparently clumps of wool. So the Vikings didn't, shave the sheep off. They plucked the clumps of wool off, and then they had to clean the wool and comb it and take all the burrs out of it. So it was sort of a lengthy process. And in fact, in the Viking Age, there were farms called sheelings where the women would go in the mountains. So the sheep were still wandering pretty much wild around them, but this is when they did a lot of work. They would often bring the cattle up there at that point, but they would do a lot of textile work during that time in preparing wool or collecting wool on bushes and things like that.
Are there any looms that survived? And maybe for those who aren't familiar with Marta Hoffman's work, you could tell us a little bit about that too.
Yeah, so Marta Hoffman did a study of the warp-weighted loom. And if you're interested in this old loom, it's actually really, in many ways, very easy to weave on it. It's not so easy to set up, but it's very, very simple to actually weave on it, but kind of slow. She decided to do a whole study. It was in 1956, I think, that she did a study on basically the history of the warp-weighted loom. So there are pockets in the North Atlantic where women continue to weave on this. In Iceland, they pretty much forget how to use this loom by 1800. So the Danish efforts are actually quite successful. But in the Faroes, not so much so. And there are online some videos of women that I think they were taken in the 50s or so, of women showing you how to warp the loom, how to weave on it, how to do all the different parts of it, which are, even if you don't understand Faroese, if you have any knowledge of textile work, you'll be able to figure it out. I'm pretty sure about it.
And we do have a copy of her classic book, The Warp Weighted Loom, in the Guild library, if anybody's interested in that.
Yeah, there's also in Norway, they continue to use it as well. There's a type of cloth called the Oakley, which is sort of a really colorful, almost type of kilim type thing, a little bit, very thick, which they continued to weave that, I think, up until about the 19th century. And the place where I actually took the course, they had one of these old looms that we were using. One of the, they have a whole setup, a whole room of these. I've got about like 10 of these warp weighted looms. But one of the looms they had was one of these really old looms as well.
Are there any traces of tablet weaving or band weaving from these sites?
Yes, there are. There's even one of the biggest, most, I would say, most wealthy or luxurious sites from the Viking Age was the Osberg boat burial, where they found actually a complete tablet weaving loom, sort of a small thing that's quite narrow. And that's done still actually a fair amount. In fact, in the North Atlantic, normally when they started to warp these looms, a characteristic of North Atlantic textiles was actually not to start like this way, the way this is what they do in Norway. They would actually start with a tablet woven band. And that was your starting border. And so it's really confusing to weave it because your wefts become your warps on this loom. So you have to kind of, when you're doing it, you have to kind of, I did one time, and it requires a little bit of, thinking like, okay, so I've got to make this weft, the weft becomes the warp. So it's like really long,
That's also how it was done in the Mediterranean. And,
right.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So the Berlo quote states, as a mode of self-presentation, textiles assert personal, ethnic, religious, and economic identities. How was self-presentation related to forms of weaving among the Norse women?
So how was it in terms of what, all those aspects? Because in terms of, like, for example, I mean, I could go for hours and hours about this.
Well, the person asking the question is an anthropology professor at UCLA.
Okay. All right. So we can have a conversation about that.
And a guild member.
Right. Well, in many ways, I think that in my work, like, on one hand, I think the way they used, for example, textiles as currency is one example of that. I mentioned to you also in Greenland, there was a shift in how textiles were woven, which was a response also to climatic adaptation. Textiles were used in terms of clothing. One thing I've worked on quite a bit is the clothing from Norse Greenland, these complete garments from the site of Heriosnes. There's about several gowns that they found. So we've been looking at various things. One of the studies I did was actually to date one of the hats. So there's a hat called the Burgundian Tall Hat, which is, quite different from the rest of the hats that was found at Heriosnes. So we decided to do a study and to see, okay, well, are they all contemporary with each other? Like, what is that going to tell us, about society and about women and so on. And one of the archaeologists who was working with me, Jette Arneborg, had already dated one fragment of the hat. And it was very patched, like many of the garments are in that context. And we found that she said, why don't you date some more of the patches? So she had dated one patch, and I dated a few other patches in sort of the base of the hat. We ended up with one date, and then we decided to date the crown. So we're using radiocarbon dating. The crown was 100 years older. And it was just like so incredible. Like, what were they doing? Was this like so important, this cloth? Was this an heirloom? Were they preserving this because it was important, because it was a connection, either it could have been a family connection, was it connection to their antecedents in Iceland? Or was it just that they had no cloth and they had to make do with what they had? You also see, for example, in Iceland, I mentioned to you that in the 17th century, the Danes come in, they take over textile production. And I always wondered to myself, women who have been weaving for this long, for 800 years, as the only weavers in Norse society, how did they take the fact that suddenly they weren't weaving anymore and was it like, oh yeah, I don't have to do this anymore, this is great, or was it they've been taken a part of their identity in a sense? And so I spent a lot of time looking through a lot of these collections of early modern textiles. There was material that came from the workshops, which was really hard to distinguish from the European imports. It was quite different from this sort of homespun, which looks more like the vadmal. And then I had the opportunity to work on a site that was the bishopric of Iceland. So it was basically the wealthiest site in the entire country, is where the bishop was lived. It had access to its own harbor, trading harbor, so it received a lot of goods that were coming in from Europe at the time. And there's all kinds of extraordinary textiles there. There's silks, there's all sorts of amazing things, and not only in terms of textiles, but also in terms of other forms of material culture. I mean, this is a site that had peacocks. They had glass. They had, incredible china from Europe. I mean, they had the best stuff because it was the wealthiest site. And I ended up working on the school. There was a school associated with the bishopric, and in the school, these were basically boys from across Iceland that were sent there to become priests in about the 18th century, 17th century. And so you would expect them, because these were the wealthiest kids, these were the kids coming from the families of chieftains, they would have the most exquisite clothes. And the abundance of clothing or cloth that I found in the site, I would say that 90% of the cloth was homespun, dirty brown rag vadmal. So what's that telling you? What's that telling you? Is that telling you about that, oh, we're trying to, we're so cool, we're wearing these fancy hats, now we're wearing wigs and we're wearing European fashion? No, they were actually wearing traditional Icelandic cloth. If that isn't resistance on the part of women telling them, no, sorry, you can try and make us change how we used to make things, but we're still wearing this stuff. And in a sense, that's, to me, is a way of expressing cultural identity as well. How could you tell an Icelander overseas? Probably by the fact that he was wearing this stuff. He was wearing these types of clothes.
Interesting. I heard a paper.
And that's why, coming back to Berlow's quote, these, to me, this is how you see this stuff. These are texts. These are texts telling you about how climates change. These are texts that tell you about decisions that women make. These are texts about resistance. These are texts about cultural identity. But they're woven texts. It's how women express themselves.
I was going to say, I heard a paper, I'd have to dig it up, but about a similar experience in Mao's China, right, where in order to, as part of the push toward industrialization, they told people not to spin and weave, they should be working in factories, but people kept doing it. Although the person who gave the talk attributed that more to sort of economic necessity, that there was not enough textiles for the families unless they did that. But it was parallel kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's also, like, I know that during the Danish trade monopoly, they decided to also get people knitting, because they didn't knit. They only had a traditional type of knitting called nalbindung, which was done in the Viking Age, but they didn't actually knit with two needles until the 16th century. When they started to knit, the Danes wanted them to knit the stockings, because it was very fashionable in Europe to wear these long woolen stockings with your garments, particularly men. And there's all kinds of written accounts in the Danish archives about these Icelanders and the Faroese who were not knitting things properly and who were intentionally making mistakes. Again, resistance. Who is going to sit down and just do this for your colonial invader? No one. So there's a lot of complaining about how it's not knitted to standards, and there's all this, badly knit stockings, and they can't use them, and so I see that as resistance, definitely.
Were there legal dictates against flooding the market with too much cloth, or was weaving so slow and difficult that there were no limits? If you were an efficient weaver, was your family better off?
I don't even know if there were official weavers in. I think everybody wove. Anybody and everybody could weave. In my book, I did some studies of how long it could take you to spin and weave one garment. You'll have to go in the book and read the whole narrative. But anyways, just to boil it down, for a household of 4 people with one woman doing all textile work, it would take her 260 days to clothe her family of 4. So what about all the, and that's nonstop. That's basically 8 hours a day. So how can you do that? The only way you can do that is by recycling your clothes, is by patching like crazy, which is what they did. And the bigger the farm, it went up to like 360 days if the farm was bigger. It means that everybody was doing this all the time. And I'm sure little children were spinning. Like you see today in South America, you see women walking and they're spinning constantly on the drop spindle. I think as soon as as kids could learn how to spin, I'm sure little girls were learning how to spin, and they were spinning constantly. And I think that, it was undoubtedly, they were also probably in the Viking Age using their slaves as well to participate in this. Or later on in medieval Iceland, they were using tenant farmers or people like that to help with the, with the work.
Yeah. I know from cloth was also used as currency in West Africa, and I know the writings that I've read there suggest that if there starts to be an oversupply, then because it's cloth, it just goes into the marketplace and people use it as cloth as opposed to as currency. And so the combination of how laborious it is to make it and the fact that there is this other use for it sort of keeps the money supply in balance.
I'm sure that was something similar there. The problem is that there's not a lot written about it. So, you're limited at some level with archaeology because we can't see that kind of phenomena going on because we don't have that kind of material. There's nothing written about that from what I can tell in the sagas, but you can sort of extrapolate, from other cultural settings that most likely if they had an abundance or a surplus of cloth, they could then, start to use it for themselves. And if you had a ship, you would use this for sales too, so.
Is there any evidence for the types of dyes that were used?
There is. I've had trouble having dye analysis done. Blues are really easy. It's a very simple technique to do it. So I have conservators do this work for me. The blues are dyed mostly with woad, and the reds are dyed with madder. If you want to read more up actually on Norse dyes, I recommend the book by Elsa Østergaard that was published in 2004 called Woven into the Earth. Which is on Greenlandic textiles. She did a really thorough analysis of the dyes they used in Greenland. Woad and madder came through. She also found that they were dyeing with iron and also various other plants, Arctic plants. But she has probably the most comprehensive study of dyes. I didn't get super far with the dyes just because of when you get into the reds, the yellows are often faded because these are all vegetal dyes. The reds apparently are really complicated and require a whole other setup and technology for it. So I was having, trouble just finding someone to do the analysis for me. So, but we got a lot out of the blues. So they're definitely not brown. But some are probably, some are dyed black too, some are dyed black. There were some that I looked at from Greenland that were very dark, and almost bluish a bit, probably dyed black, So,
well, thank you so much. This was wonderful. And I can tell from the comments, there's a lot of enthusiasm about it. So much appreciated.
I was going to say, if anybody wants to contact me with more questions, I can put up my email.
Great.
Hang on a sec. Let me see.
And also, I know a few people had to leave, so I will be putting together videos that.
Okay, so I'll just put my email here if you have any other questions about this.
Great. And as I say, the book will, when I connect with Chantal, I'll donate.
There's a lot of it in there also. If you have more questions, look in there because
it's really a rich piece of work. So really nice. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for being here, and
everybody have a good summer, and we will see you back in September to talk about WEF. and thanks. Take care.
Bye-bye.